What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I want to talk to you about the most unkillable build in Destiny. Like seriously, you can just face tank enemy fire from loads of enemies and not die. This is extremely valuable, especially in Legend Onslaught, as if everyone dies, you lose. I've been last Guardian standing many times with this build and been able to res my teammates to keep the run going. The build all revolves around the Titan Exotic Stronghold, which has the intrinsic perk Clenched Fist. Maximizes guard stats on equipped swords. You take reduced damage while blocking with a sword. Rapidly damaging targets after blocking shots with a sword grants restoration for a duration determined by the number of shots blocked. So basically, the more damage you block, the longer the duration of restoration you get. This is the perfect guard buff, and it can go up to times 100, which would give you 16 seconds of restoration times 2. And one thing to note is, while you have restoration, you can't build up stacks of perfect guard anymore. You have to wait till it completely runs out. So ideally, you will proc resto, then beat down the enemies with your sword, and then right before restoration runs out, you want to block some more damage so that you can build up perfect guard again when it runs out. And restoration isn't our only source of healing with this build. Of course, we are on Strand Titan with Banner of War, which buffs our sword damage by 10%. It also buffs our melee damage by 40%, and as we get stacks of Banner of War, we get a pulse of healing. So to get Banner of War going, we can do a finisher, get a melee kill, or a sword kill, so it's super easy to activate with this build. And then we just keep getting kills to get more stacks of Banner of War. And our teammates' kills will also count towards this as long as they are near us. And in Onslaught, this is extremely easy to do. So at max stacks, we will get a pulse of healing every second. And this is just added healing on top of the restoration that we'll have from the Stronghold Gauntlets. The other aspect we have is Into the Fray, which gives us Woven Mail when we destroy a Tangle. Woven Mail gives us a 45% damage resistance for 10 seconds, which is really good. It makes us even more of a tank and allows us to survive things like a boss stomp which would normally kill us. But there is one thing you should note with grabbing a Tangle. The game always prioritizes picking up batteries over grabbing things like Tangles, and this has definitely gotten me killed. So just watch out for that. It's extremely annoying. It also prioritizes batteries over revives, so Bungie really needs to fix this annoying interaction. Anyways, after that we have Fragments, and this is where our stats take a hit, but it is very worth it. We have Threat of Warding, where picking up an Orb of Power grants Woven Mail. Trust me, even with Banner of War and Restoration times 2, sometimes in the later waves of Legend Onslaught, the enemies are so thick that you will want this damage resistance, as they will still be able to melt you if you're not careful. You can always block with your sword to mitigate basically all the damage, but you also won't be able to be offensive too while you're blocking, and this is where this fragment comes into play. Plus, in Onslaught, there are orbs everywhere, so this fragment has huge uptime. Yes, you get -10 to resilience, but it's definitely worth it. Next, we have Threat of Fury. This gives us melee energy when we hit enemies with a Tangle. This is a super strong fragment, and it is nice to have lots of melees because they are buffed from Banner of War, and are an easy way to make a Tangle and give our teammates Woven Mail when we destroy that Tangle, helping them to survive too. Again, this is -10 to our strength stat, but the gains far outweigh the loss of 10 stat points. Then we have Threat of Generation. This gives us grenade energy for dealing damage. This is excellent as it's just a passive buff to our grenade regen. We run Shackle Grenades with this build, which can stun Unstoppables, but they can also suspend large waves of enemies, which is extremely useful in Onslaught as it just keeps them from getting to the ADU and it gives you more time to deal with them. And lastly, we have Threat of Binding. This actually gives us +10 to resilience, which is really nice, and it causes enemies to get suspended when you kill an enemy near them with your super. This is absolutely excellent for crowd control. The Blade Fury super goes very hard on Titan, but if you didn't know, you also deal 25% more damage to suspended enemies with your super. So your attacks will be hitting even harder. And this even works on bosses. No, they don't get suspended, but they do have the suspend debuff on them for a brief time, so you can hit them for yellow numbers for about a second after doing a heavy attack. But if enemies are right near the boss, then Threat of Binding will kick in and do this for you. And speaking of your super, you could swap to Syntheseps if you really wanted to optimize, as with enemies around you, this will proc Biotic Enhancements, allowing your super to deal 1.5 times more damage. But anyways, I can't express how great this fragment is in a game mode like Onslaught. So that is it for the main part of the build, but we have mods that can enhance it even further. On the helmet, I run Font of Wisdom for 30 more intellect whenever we are charged with light. And again, in Onslaught, there's orbs everywhere, so we'll be charged with light basically all the time, so this will help reduce our passive cooldown. Then we have Arc Siphon. This is because I run an Arc Sword with this build, which I'll get to soon, so as we get sword multi-kills, we'll make an Orb of Power. However, I didn't have this on for some of the gameplay, but trust me, you definitely want this, because as you're just shredding through ads with your Arc Sword, you'll make an orb, and this will give you Charge with Light as well as Woven Mail. And then I just had Heavy Ammo Scout because it only costs 1 and I had no room for anything else. On the gloves, I had Font of Vigor for plus 30 to my strength stat whenever I'm charged with light, but if you only have 70 discipline with this build, then run Font of Focus instead. I have 100 discipline with my build, so focus would have done nothing for me, and then I have a solar loader on for my solar hand cannon. On the chest piece, I always run Void, Arc, and Solar Resist and Onslaught, so go with that or whatever you think is best. On the boots, I had Arc Scavenger for more sword ammo, Arc Weapon Surge for more sword damage, and Kinetic Weapon Surge for more kinetic weapon damage. Again, this build is all about being charged with light from picking up orbs, so we are using those charges to their full potential. This will buff our arc and kinetic weapon damage by 10%. And then on the class item, we have a time dilation mod to make the armor charge last 15 seconds instead of 10, and Outreach and Bomber for melee and grenade energy when we cast our Barricade. I do run Towering Barricade with this build, but I rarely cast it as blocking with a sword is all the protection we ever need. For stats, focus on 100 Resilience first, and then 100 Discipline, and then whatever you want. But 100 Resil is all that is mandatory for the damage resistance. The font mods help make up our other stats, and the fragments we run are very worth it for the hit to our stats. For weapons, I run the Forerunner. I do want to work on a video of the best weapons to run an Onslaught, but Forerunner is at the top of that list. It has deep ammo reserves, and it's excellent for taking out the Tormentor's weak spots at a safe distance. I can't stress enough how awesome this weapon is in Onslaught. We also run Anti-Barrier Sidearm so that it can deal with Barrier Servitors and Barrier Knights. I have a Zali's Bane with Explosive Payload and One For All, and this thing hits harder than Sunshot when One For All is procced. I broke it all down in my Midnight Coup God Roll video, so check that out after this one if you want more info. But this hand cannon hits very hard, even in later waves of Onslaught, and the important thing is that it's solar, so we can proc Flint Striker from the Artifact mod to give us Radiant. I also run Rays of Precision to make ignitions with Solar Precision Final Blows. And we also have Unstoppable Hand Cannon, so it can stun unstops as well, which is very handy, but so can our Shackle Grenade, but it's nice to have all our bases covered. And speaking of that, one slight downside to this build setup is we don't have a way to stun Overload champions, but I'm sure someone on your team will. And then for a sword, I run Bequest. This sword has Relentless Strikes and Surrounded. It's the hardest hitting sword in the game with Enhanced Surrounded procced, and it is often procced during the ad waves and even on bosses. But it's not great for things like Sky Bombers and stuff that are out on their own. But regardless, it's still very good, and Relentless Strikes gives us sword ammo back, so it's also very ammo efficient, which is really nice. I mainly use a sword with this build, and then use a Forerunner for Shriekers and Tormentors, and then Zali's Bane just occasionally, usually just to proc Radiant. So that is the full build, but now what I really want to talk about is the awesome utility of this build. It's truly the best build in the game for doing Onslaught objectives. If you have to capture the mines and the timer is running low, there's nothing to fear. You can just walk up to the mine and block with your sword and capture it. And the Ogre or Brig can't do anything to stop you. It's excellent. I've also pulled Tormentor aggro while blocking with the sword, and even if he suppresses you, you just keep standing there. This allows your teammates to safely damage the Tormentor from a distance. And you can also manipulate the bosses and tank all their aggro. You can walk into huge groups of Exploder Shanks or Cursed Thralls and tank their explosions. You can grab a revive in basically any scenario. Yes, there is a bit of a skill gap with learning some of this stuff, but once you do, you will literally never die unless you mess up. Or Bungie makes you grab a battery instead of a Tangle or a Res, which has happened to me. But for the most part, as long as you stay blocking, you're fine. You can even block the freezing projectiles when running the Spark. I tested this without Stronghold also, and turns out any sword block can do it. But yeah, I would often just run the Spark and dunk it, and it was super easy because I just held block the entire time. You can also stand there and grab the reinforcements in the boss room with no issue. There's huge upside to this build when it comes to doing the OBJ. But there's also one pretty big downside, and that is damage output. It is great at tanking aggro and doing all this stuff, but while you are doing that, you can't often output damage if a ton of things are shooting at you. If you have good teammates who can deal lots of damage, this is more than fine. But if your teammates aren't good, then they can still get overwhelmed. Like, I had Demolitionist spawn on wave 49 and my teammates died, And I was beating on the Demolitionist as best as I could, but this build doesn't have big stopping power like a Consecration Titan with Pyrogales, and that can cost you sometimes. Again, it really just comes down to your team build composition, but I did want to throw that in there. You are trading some damage output for max survivability, but trust me, the survivability is truly the best in the game. I also tried this build with the Lament, which is one of my favorite weapons, but I didn't like it as much. I had to lower my frames to get the hit detection to be somewhat decent, but on wizards, you still couldn't hit them properly. And the revved attack also uses your sword charge. And that's another thing to be aware of. On the bequest or whatever sword you use, try to only use light attack so that you can always have your sword charge up, because if it's at 0, you cannot block. So something to be aware of. Plus, the Lament takes your exotic slot, so then I couldn't run Forerunner. So I think a good legendary sword is the way to go with this build. And make sure you don't use all your sword ammo either. You always want at least one swing. But this isn't too big of a deal as ammo is really plentiful in Onslaught. And one final thing is for the drip, I was going for an old school Dark Souls Knight type look. I tried to get a chainmail-esque look with some Iron Banner gear. I just thought it fit the theme for the build. And that is it for the video. I hope that you enjoyed it and that it helps you get a level 50 clear on Legend. Or at least helps you to survive better. Honestly, there's no better survivability loadout in the entire game. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and sub for more awesome Destiny 2 content. And lastly, if you're still watching, then thanks so much for watching to the end. It means a lot. Happy Onslaught farming and take care.